Thank you so much. And my bio is a handful over there. Might have to edit that to make it a little bit more simple. So let me just start the presentation here. All right, perfect. Now let's go. Whoops, sorry about that. Now you're getting a sneak peek, sorry about that. Spoilers. All right, so I was supposed to be joined here with our client, Brotzman. She is the manager for human resources and training at Toyota Material Handling. Unfortunately, she was exposed to COVID last evening, so now I have to take care of some of her slides. But don't worry, you're in good hands. We spoke about it earlier, and it should still be a great presentation. But Holly's job, she manages over 230 dealerships throughout Canada and the States. And she's responsible for technicians. Well, she and her team are responsible for the training for technicians. And they have been the ones spearheading the virtual reality training project that we worked on together. As for myself, my name is Roni Cerga, CEO. We are a Toronto-based virtual reality company and been very privileged to work with some of the most leading companies in the world, helping them deploy and scale enterprise virtual reality solutions. And by the way, I'm glad we have such a large crowd. When things were starting out, I only saw a few people, and now I don't know if I'm more worried that there were less or that there's more. So thanks for coming. So going into the challenge, so why did Toyota Material Handling start to look at this technology? And I think that's kind of like one of the key things we need to look at before we start measuring ROIs, understanding kind of like the need. So the biggest thing you'll notice in that map that you see up on the screen is that there are over 230 locations. So extremely decentralized, kind of like a center for business. And throughout these locations, there are more than 4,000 technicians that require training. On top of that, there are more than 50 unique products that the company supports with myriad of configurations. So the challenge with that automatically comes to product availability. Not every dealership can have every single product available to them to train the technicians on. A second one is comprehension that is tied to product availability. As you can imagine, if you do not have a product in front of you, it's very difficult to get hands-on training on it. And as well as technician shortage is another big challenge. So having trainers that can access all these different locations is also very challenging. Now, for the solution, and after this slide, I'm actually going to play a little video and speak over it and describe the solution, because it's great to talk about it. It's a whole other thing to see it. There are a few components for this whole solution to actually work. So the first one is the hardware. Toyota Material Handling deployed 300 Oculus for Business units throughout their dealers. And what we had to do was recreate a digital double of their training facility out of Indiana. And that included the different products as well as interactions. Now, the challenge with having standalone VR is that you are also working with great processor like XR2. They're still limited in how much performance you can get out of it. So as you can see on my presentation over there, it's hard to read, but it takes a lot of modeling. So some traditional BIM models are hundreds of thousands of triangles complex, and we have to bring those to tens of thousands so that the content can actually run on a standalone device. The second layer is interaction design. So basically having procedures and processes mapped out in VR. And finally, multiplayer is something, with the metaverse that we've seen more and more. In this actual application, the application has different modes. One of them can be single player led. The other one can have a trainer host a session that's joined by trainees, and they can go through these different processes and procedures together to learn about the different pieces of equipment. Anything from part identification, which is the kind of like the initial pilot that this project started with, all the way to maintenance and repair. The last component is MDM, so basically a tool to push, pull, control applications on the standalone VR headsets. There are some great vendors you can check out, like Arbor XR, for example. You should check out some of their booth and content, and they allow you to control the devices so that the users aren't able to just install whatever they want, but they'll only be able to access the applications that have been approved by the enterprise. And finally, I think the part that we'll focus on the most during this talk is analytics, because it is impossible to measure return on investment without understanding how the content is performing, how it's being used by the users, and what kind of results we're getting out of it. So with analytics, there's basically two layers to it that tie in directly to ROI. The first, as you may be used to typical software, is usage and users, right? So how many people are going through the content? Are they successful? Are they not? How much time is being spent on it? And benchmark that towards traditional methods for training, right? That's pretty straightforward. But what's interesting that we can do in VR that is impossible to do in real life is that we can also go into detailed in-app analytics. And they can vary depending on the application. It can be something as simple as seeing how an employee is doing through recognizing hazards. So were they able to identify 70%, 80%, 90%? Or were they stuck at a single process in a procedure? Did they use the right PPEs? So very high-level analytics showing how the platform and the applications are used, all the way down to more granular information, which focuses more on the actual course itself. Oops. Now, up on the screen, you actually have a photo of the real world, and underneath it, you have a photo of the simulation. It'll be a lot clearer on the video, but they're almost identical to each other. So it takes a lot of, I'd say, technical know-how to be able to have this applications run at this fidelity in standalone. But what do they do? Well, really, the biggest things that Toyota wanted to get out of the system was really to increase technician confidence and also repair efficiency, as well as getting new learner engagement. We work with younger and younger demographic over time, right? And having them be more competent and more comfortable in their jobs also has a direct impact into things such as reducing fixed time rates. So this ties into directly into the earlier slide that I spoke about analytics. So analytics and sort of like measuring return on investment just by looking at it from a VR perspective is limited in its outlook. We can only really measure it if we benchmark it to how things happen in the real world. So the way TMH and other clients do things is that they use the data and analytics that are gathered from the applications in virtual reality, and they compare those to real world impact by seeing what the improvement is in performance. And as you can see on the list there is like, okay, you know, what is the customer satisfaction now that the technicians has been trained in VR versus now? And finally, it has decreases in stuff like repair cost, which is a direct material impact on the bottom line. And some of the things that are very easy to measure in terms of ROI are things like travel time. Easy way to do that is organizations that are decentralized and have locations on a global or on a countrywide scale. A good way to measure that is to see, okay, how many technicians are traveling, how many times a year, let's say, to go to HQ to get specific type of training, right? And how can we reduce that in VR? Now, before I go into the next slide is actually going to make your lives a little bit easier. It's an online tool. There's a link underneath it over there that you can use. You can take a little snippet of it, basically vrvisiongroup.com ROI Calculator, because it's a lot easier than having a spreadsheet. We decided to build an interactive tool where organizations can enter all this, input this information, and see whether they would lose money or whether there would be a return in investment in deploying this type of technology. And I'll go through some of the items on this presentation. So the first thing you'll notice is number of employees. And that doesn't mean number of employees in the whole company. It actually refers to the number of employees that will be using the technology or the specific course that you are benchmarking the ROI on. Average hourly pay will allow you to understand time savings and cost savings related to the time that they're spending. And now, you wouldn't be able to have ROI unless you understand your cost. And when it comes to virtual reality training, there's really 4 big buckets of cost. 2 of those are focused more around capital expenditures, which typically is something like creating the content for virtual reality development. And the second one that's still cost similar to it is implementing VR training hardware. Obviously, you can't do any VR training without VR headsets. So accounting for those 2 is critical. But there are 2 more items you need to account for. That the fourth one is something people usually forget. So finally, we have licensing. So that could be something like maintenance and support that's required to support this software throughout its life cycle. It could be licensing an MDM, or if you are getting something out of the box, or you're licensing a self-serve system, it is the cost per user or per administrator that you require to run the system. But finally, it's the internal resource cost. So how much time will the company spend in the initial phase of deployment? This is typically when we see hours spent by IT, hours spent by subject matter experts in helping guide and create these courses, and finally integrate that into the greater ecosystem, technology ecosystem for an enterprise. Second to that, we usually have the costs that go towards the SMEs or the trainers that will be deploying virtual reality itself. So that gives us a good picture of what the cost is going to be, at least on an annual basis, for deploying this type of solution. And now we can look at things like travel savings that we mentioned earlier. Great way to do that. We need to see what the trip reductions would potentially be, a cost per trip. Some trips can be short. It could be a few minutes to go from one location to the next. Others may require long flights and days off-site. And finally, we calculate the hours lost. Now, one thing to note about travel savings and just ROI in general for best practices is that it requires some type of change management within an organization. Because if the employees continue to travel the same way they did before, then that'll diminish the ROI. So some changes beyond deploying virtual reality training solutions is required for that to become a success. The final components are around training itself. Because sometimes you may not have any travel-related stuff, but you still want to increase or decrease the time that it takes to train people, right? So that's where we're looking at traditional training duration. So if something takes 8 hours to train somebody on site in the real world, then you can benchmark versus how much time it's going to take to train them in a virtual environment, as well as the amount of sessions. So how often this would repeat throughout the year. A great thing as well is efficiency, time cost savings as well. So you can see by a percentage what kind of reduction you would have. Materials is something that is more common around manufacturing. For example, every time you would train employees, there would be some type of material either that would get consumed in the training or would be destroyed through new users being unsafe with equipment. Which takes us to the final one, which is incidents. Now, with incidents, this is basically looking at incidents that can happen in a hazardous environment versus completely eliminating them. So what I'm going to do next is actually play a little video of the application in action so that you can all understand what's happening within it. Just wait for the casting. So the video is only 5 minutes. This training takes about 25 minutes in real life. Thank you. It's about to start. And I'm just going to speak on top of it and describe kind of like what's happening. So the first thing that they see is whether they are a first-time user or not is to go through a tutorial. Using virtual reality equipment itself takes time and practice, so new users typically go through a tutorial to understand how they interact in the virtual world. The second thing you see here, there's 3 different types of modes. We have trainer education, we have single user education, which is basically single player training, and finally we have evaluation. So with single user education, what happens in the system is that the user will have highlights, visual highlights, as well as voiceovers telling them and describing each step in the process and procedure they have to do. In evaluation, that whole system is turned off. So the user has to, by themselves, be able to navigate the system once they've been trained. What we're seeing here is actually multiplayer, which is kind of like the preferred method that Toyota Material Handling had for training in virtual reality. We decided the groups to keep them at 8 because it would become overwhelming for the trainers to manage larger groups than that. So first, they all meet up in a lobby. All of these things are scheduled and managed through their existing LMS externally, and then they know what time they have to get into the VR applications and start it up. We have an unlimited amount of rooms and users that can access the training, and we're adding continuously to their vehicles and processes. So now we jump into the virtual environment. We have 2 trainees, and we are seeing things from the perspective of the trainer over here. So right now he's just talking to them, explaining to them that the first thing that they need to do is pick up their PPEs. And we're going to actually see what that looks like from the trainer's perspective very shortly. And this environment is as close to a digital double to their real-life training facility as you can get. There's the context menu system, so anytime you have an interactable object, it'll show you what it is, so you know what you're doing with it. And then fast forwarding a little bit, the trainer can also see on top of the trainees' heads how they're tracking with the training. So if they get stuck at a specific point, they know to help them out. The little icon there, that's what we call visual inspections. What it's doing is it's using the kind of like the field of view of the headset to understand where somebody's looking at something. It's great for visual inspections and tracking if people are looking at the right things. But the next thing they need to do is basically grab and disconnect the battery. And then finally, within the watch, we have a smartwatch menu, which basically tells kind of like the trainer who is in the training session. They can kick people, they can mute them. But also, it'll show them how they're tracking with training. So it'll either give them a breakdown of the step that they have most recently completed, the step that they're on, and the step that's coming up, or how they're tracking with a specific process. The next thing we're going to talk about that we had in the presentation earlier is interactions. So this vehicle is basically a digital double of the real forklift. I don't think it's been manufactured yet, so we had to use the BIM models and recreate it. Now, the trainer is showing the trainees how to remove the components one by one and how to get to them. So now we have a little bit of interaction. They can see that, okay, this is a 12-millimeter bolt. You'll notice he grabs the tool. It doesn't work. And these are things that we'll look at the evaluation period as well. So are they using the right tools for the right job? And if they're not, then we're tracking all of it. So they'll use the tool to remove the bolts. So they understand that, okay, there's hidden compartments. There's areas they need to access and use these things. And at the same time, the trainees are talking to them, and they're discussing this whole process together. So I'm going to let this play for a little bit longer, just to show you one last part. So see, there's little hidden compartments that if they cannot get to it, it'll be impossible for them to remove this component. So what we're seeing here is basically part identification. So the first thing that most people need to do is understand the different components. Then different types of solutions after this do things such as maintenance and repair. So what happens if there's a broken hose? What happens if there's electrical issues with the system? And there's every time they click on a little part you see there, a little pop-up of a real-world photo will pop up, and it basically just showcases what that would look like in the real world, which is almost identical to what you see in CG. Finally, one thing that the trainer can do as well is, especially in larger groups, they can see how the trainees are tracking, so that if somebody is behind with their steps, the trainer can see it, and they can guide them in real time as they go through the training. So you can see all the little components there broken down, and a real-life photo comparing it to the virtual one. Up on the wall, you can see the trainees that are in the session, and the trainer can see that, okay, one of them is struggling. They haven't been able to identify too many, and the reason for that was that they're just been, they're new. So that's pretty much it with the video presentation. Now, I'm going to open it to Q&A, but on a technical level, for people who are a bit more technical, everything has been developed in Unity. We're using Photon for networking, and we have just migrated our SDK and our platforms over to OpenXR so that they are available on all types of hardware, as long as they're standalone. So, and if you have any questions, again, my name is Roni Cerga. You can reach out to me after the questions we may have here offline. Be happy to help. I'll even be outside. You can even try this application in real time as well. I know I won't be able to do it with all of you because it's only one headset, but some of you can go through it. So happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
With Visionary Training Resources. Are they doing a lot of continuous updating, monitoring of the cost savings? So there's the initial ROI to make the investment, and then of course you got to continue the analytics. So I'm sure they continue with that data collection and refinement to justify it and discover the things you didn't think of in the beginning.
Oh, it's a very good point. So they do that all the time. So for example, they'll find things that they never expected, especially when they make mistakes that goes into continuous improvement. For example, when they were doing, this was actually with manufacturing, but when they were doing hazard identification training, they identified that, well, we're noticing that 90% of our people are missing, it was a simple procedure, it's called stop point look. So then they identified, well, there's an actual gap in training, and they would fill it up. And they also measure ROI on a course-by-course basis because they're continuously adding modules to training. So they're continuously seeing how those modules benchmark towards real-life applications. Some give better ROI and better return than others. So that's the ones they try to focus on and create more of. Yeah, over there.
Hi. I was curious, how widely has this application been deployed across Toyota's manufacturing facilities?
Great question. So this one is with Toyota Material Handling. We also work with Toyota Motor Manufacturing for their vehicles. With those, we've been working with Mississippi, Canada, so about 4 plants in Kentucky. But this one is actually across 230 dealerships for Toyota Material Handling. Over here.
Thanks. My question is it only trainer-led sessions, or is it also automated sessions, so guides type of
Yep.
thing?
So there's 3 modes to it. There is the trainer-led sessions, there is the single-player guided mode, and there is the evaluation mode, which is basically seeing if they're, without any highlights or voiceover, seeing how competent they are doing things. Over there.
Can you speak a bit more to the overall budget? I know you're not going to discuss, how much money you made and so forth, but when looking at training projects, we've always found that the transition from BIM and CAD models and the interaction design has sucked up all the budget in the room. And obviously, you're at a big scale here with 200 plus dealerships, which helps. But I'd be curious to hear sort of a high level.
Oh yeah, of course.
What you charged and what percentage those were as components.
No, absolutely. So we'll talk about kind of like there's 3 components to this, really. So you have, like you said, the 3D modeling and the beam optimization. For us, this whole project that you see here started at the start of October last year and finished mid-December. So it's a pretty quick turnaround. The rough costs for a similar size project, not this one specifically, are in the low 6 figures. So something under $200,000 per module is what we're typically looking at. And the breakdown for that, that's actually just another good question, is that typically what you'll see is that the highest cost in the beginning is around creating the 3D assets and the 3D environments. Once those have been created, then we can kind of like recreate and focus on interaction design. So typically you'll see 60% of the cost be asset creation, and then 40% interaction design. But future modules see kind of like that more than flipped into a 70% being interaction design and a cost reduction of about 50% from what the initial rollout is typically.
I think we have time for one more.
Sorry, over here. He had it earlier, that's why.
Thank you. 2 quick questions. One is, how are you handling hardware? Is it all on the customer? Are you helping with that? And then the second one is, do you guys just focus on creating these training modules, or do you guys do, as a company, do you guys do a suite of kind of 3D services?
Mm-hmm. So we just focus on training. When it comes to the hardware, companies simply buy their own. CDW is an authorized vendor for Oculus for Business, but some other companies like Pico and HTC will sell their devices direct to customer. Initially, we used to help with hardware, but honestly, we found that it's better if the clients own their own hardware. That way, they're not stuck with a specific vendor. Things can change. So you want to mitigate your risk as a customer, and we wanted to help them with that. I think do we have 1 more minute, or is it overtime? I think I have 1 more minute. I think somebody had a question over here. Now I see. Good decision on no heels.
So I kind of feel like Rip Van Winkle here because I was working with Silicon Graphics so many years ago on simulation training. But the one thing I think about, we're not talking about cost, is working with the client and decide and their time. And these experiences are very different than a live trainer in terms of what you can train. So two parts to the same question, but how do you work with a client to kind of figure out what the curriculum is? Do you bring in the structural designer? Do they do it? And then how do you figure out what's relevant for the environment to actually train on? Like, you can spend a lot of time turning that bolt, but that might not be a risky thing versus some other thing that might have enormous risk. So how do you navigate that?
Oh, it's a very good question. It is a complex answer that I'll try to do in under 10 seconds. I'm just looking at the time down there. But basically the way we do that is we work with the subject matter experts within the company's organization. And when it comes to interactions themselves, we decide with them, okay, whether you have to turn the bolt 10 times in real life, is that important to do in VR? So you'll notice there you do it 3 times. But we try to keep the essence of the process and the interaction in place. And our clients are the ones that guide us, and their instructional designers and SMEs are the ones that do that for us. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. So if you have any more questions, again, my name was up on the screen. Feel free to connect. I'll be outside answering any more questions anyone may have. Appreciate it.